The Queen sends Francis to France. Francis must have been in contact with the Queen, for we next learn that when he was just 18 years old, suddenly he is torn from his legal studies by the Queen and sent to France with the English ambassador. We know he was sent away personally and directly by Elizabeth because he writes, "I went with Sir Amyas Paulet into France from Her Majesty's royal hand. Since then, I have made Her Majesty's service the scope of my life. No other young nobleman was sent to France directly from Her Majesty's royal hand. No other youth was sent in the entourage of the Queen's ambassador and given entry to the French court. Why the sudden removal to France? One possibility is that at 18 years old and having learned of his birthright, Francis was not being discreet. This, however, is conjecture." Francis Bacon in love. The French court was licentious, yet brilliantly intellectual. King Henry of Navarre, purely for reasons of state, had married Margaret de Valois. Though her beauty had inspired all the French poets and literatures, her husband had been so indifferent to her that the marriage had not been consummated. When 18-year-old Francis Bacon arrived at the French court, a divorce was being arranged at Margaret's instigation. Aged 25, the beautiful French queen was in the prime of womanhood. She was the recognized leader of the court, especially on the social and intellectual side. Her outgoing personality, the snowy whiteness of her complexion, along with raven black hair and her many accomplishments, made her the centre of attraction. Queen Margaret's salon was thronged with thinkers and scholars, philosophers, scientists, poets, literateurs, inventors, and the like, attracted by the genius of her intellectual personality. Thus it was that when Francis Bacon was introduced to the French court, he discovered a vibrant spirit vastly different from that of his homeland. Francis promptly fell in love, and the woman who stirred him was no less a person than Queen Marguerite. His passion for Marguerite had the direct result of bringing into being the most remarkable diary of emotion ever written. He wrote a series of sonnets to her, outpouring his emotions in verse. And throughout the years, to old age, when in great strife, he found heart ease by pursuing the habit he had acquired in France. The Marguerite sonnets were the beginnings of the mysterious body of verse known today as Shakespeare's sonnets. From his contact with Marguerite, he acquired the practice of clothing emotions in imaginative terms. During his stay in France, we know that Francis visited Spain, Italy, Germany, Vienna, Padua, Verona, and Florence, all the while gathering important information for his later writings. The English ambassador, Sir Amyas Paulet, must have been aware of Francis Bacon's infatuation with Queen Marguerite, and would be duty-bound to inform Queen Elizabeth. In February 1579, as we already know, Sir Nicholas Bacon died. He is said to have caught a chill, and Francis returned to England. Life in England. From 1579, after his return from France, Francis Bacon lived at Gray's Inn, involved in legal studies, philosophical pursuits, poetry, speech writing, playwriting, and the design of masques and entertainments. Meanwhile, Francis's stepbrother Anthony Bacon travelled around the continent as an intelligencer, a spy, for the Queen. Anthony, who left England in September 1579, for a tour of the continent, sent Francis a constant stream of intelligence as well as a supply of books and manuscripts from the various countries he visited. In 1592, after 12 years abroad, Anthony returned to England. He and Francis established a private scrivenery, a writing workshop, funded mainly by Anthony's inheritance from his father. It was about the time Anthony returned home that Francis Bacon started his Promus of Formularies and Elegancies, a storehouse or notebooks, which are now housed in the British Museum, containing nearly 2,000 observations and expressions in several languages, many of which were incorporated into the Shakespeare plays. More on the Promus later. In April 1594, Anthony took up residence in Bishopgate. Francis continued to live at Gray's Inn, but in addition had a country residence at Twickenham Lodge across the river from Richmond Palace, where some of his literary activity took place. Any open acknowledgement of writing poetry and plays would have been likely to hinder Francis Bacon's pursuit of high office. The Earl of Surrey wrote, "Poets were ever thought unfit for state." The publication of any literature could involve its author in criminal punishment if it were thought to be libelous, licentious, or politically offensive. Hence many authors wrote anonymously to assume a little more liberty and freedom of speech. Shortly we'll discuss the pseudonym adopted by Francis for this purpose. Anthony Bacon died in 1601. His surviving correspondence, carefully collected by Francis Bacon, resides in Lambeth Palace Library. On the 24th of March, 1603, the Queen dies. She does not name an heir. King James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. From 1607 onwards, Francis was appointed to increasingly higher positions of state by King James. 1609, Sir Francis Bacon writes a eulogy to Elizabeth I entitled Felicem Memoriam Elizabetha. William Shakespeare of Stratford writes not a word. The production of the so-called Shakespeare plays became correspondingly less until in 1613, when Francis became Attorney General and they ceased altogether. That is, until the first folio published in a period 1621 to 1626, when Francis Bacon had fallen from grace, was unemployed, and so had free time. Remember, dates are important. What's in a name? In Elizabethan times, playwrights were frowned upon. It was not a profession for an aristocrat or gentleman. To reveal his true identity would have resulted in harsh consequences. So Francis Bacon chose a pseudonym. In actual fact, he had more than one pseudonym, but we will concentrate on the main one, Pallas Athena. Pallas Athena is the Greek goddess of wisdom. She is the patroness of the useful and elegant arts, imparting the Masonic virtues of prudence, courage, and perseverance. Britannia on English coins is modelled on this goddess. In Greek art, she is depicted with a helmet on her head. She held the spear of knowledge in her right hand, poised to strike at the serpent of ignorance writhing under her foot. The helmet denoted that she waged invisibly a silent war against sloth and ignorance. She was usually placed on the Greek temples with a golden spear in her hand. When the morning rays of the sun glinted on the weapon, causing it apparently to tremble, the people were in the habit of saying, "Athena is shaking her spear." She was thus known as the Shaker of the Spear. Members of the Pallas Athena secret literary society in London had a ritual created by Francis Bacon and were initiated with an elaborate ceremonial. The initiate was capped with the helmet of Pallas to denote he was henceforth an invisible in the fight for human advancement. A large spear was placed in his hand, indicative of a pen, for he was to shake the spear of knowledge at the dragons of ignorance. Francis Bacon was head of this literary band of spear shakers. The 16th century was an age when literary disguises often employed a hyphen in a name resonant with meaning. The hyphen shake space spear on Thorpe's 1609 edition of Shake-Spear sonnets was indicative of a pseudonym. The sonnets were not published under the name William Shakespeare, but simply as Shake-Spear's sonnets. We've dealt with why Shakespeare was chosen as the name, so what about William? William, which is a very common name in England even to the present day, alludes to Apollo's golden helmet of light, for which both Apollo and his feminine counterpart, Pallas Athena, were particularly noted, along with their shaking spears. Francis Bacon was often referred to as Apollo by his peers. Coincidentally, when Francis was born, Queen Elizabeth was given two names by the court astrologer John Dee, who was privy to the secret of the baby, and who had been introduced to Elizabeth by Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Using astrological charts, the names selected by Dee were for either Francis or William. Francis Bacon had a vocabulary of some 20,000 words. He painted broad canvases of life that taught the triumph of goodness and the dethronement of evil, great epics of moral power. If Bacon, being an aristocrat, had openly declared the views that he put into the mouths of various characters in the plays, he would have been brought into conflict with church and state. In 1623, the Shakespeare plays had been gathered together in an omnibus volume containing 20 plays printed for the first time and 16 previously printed. These 16 previously printed plays were largely rewritten, but by whom? Shakespeare of Stratford, be it remembered, had died 7 years earlier in 1616, whereas Sir Francis Bacon died in 1626, which is 3 years after the folio was released. Alice Barnum Bacon. Was Sir Francis Bacon married? On May 10, 1606, Bacon, who was 45 years old, married Alice Barnum. She was 14. Today we think of 14 as far too young for marriage, yet it was not so then. Alice, who was a commoner and not intellectually gifted, was probably chosen to placate King James, who would have been aware of Francis's bloodline. By marrying a commoner, the claim to the throne is removed. It also protects Bacon, who could have been marked as a threat to the monarchy. This is an eyewitness account of the wedding ceremony, taken from a letter of May 11th, 1606, written by Dudley Carleton to John Chamberlain. Sir Francis Bacon was married yesterday to his young wench in Marylebone Chapel. He was clad from top to toe in purple. The choice of purple was significant because by a law passed in 1464, no commoner could wear purple. Bacon chose to flout the law, perhaps in a last defiant gesture as to his birthright. He was not penalised. Francis and Alice remained childless. Could it be that Francis and his young bride never consummated the marriage? At the age of 14, Alice would hardly be likely to force the issue of intercourse, and there is speculation that Bacon is bisexual. At 21 years of age, Alice was rumoured to have found a lover. In 1626, Bacon died aged 66 years old. 11 days later, Alice married a Sir John Underhill, who was the gentleman usher of their household. Death of Sir Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626. Eulogies to Bacon. Bacon's death was the occasion of a great outflow of tributes from the literary establishment, as well as from the country in general. A special publication resulted, known as Manus Verulamini. It is important to keep this in mind. This contained 32 elegies written on the death of Francis Bacon by his colleagues of Cambridge and Oxford. The most striking aspect of the praises in this publication of 1626 is the emphasis on his poetry rather than his prose or philosophical works, with many references to Apollo, Pallas Athena and the Muses. Here are just a few of the eulogies. R.C. of Trinity College. Thou wert born of Minerva, Minerva being the Roman name for Pallas Athena. Rector, King's College. He wrote stories of love more refined, which still do interpret great Bacon's muse with vigour choicer by far than the 9 muses fabled in story. William Boswell. None who survive him can marry so sweetly Themis, the goddess of the law, to Pallas, the goddess of wisdom. Other eulogies called him the master of fable, the noble day star of the muses, Quirinus, which is spear shaker, the 10th muse, the learned Apollo, the leader of the great band of muses. Acknowledging Bacon's poetry, the jewel most precious of letters concealed, R.C. of Trinity College. Part of thy works truly lies buried, Robert Ashley. These clear words from Bacon's literary friends show that they acknowledged he wrote with the penmanship of a genius.